to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Season 5 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Brooke Prentis is a Waka Waka woman and Aboriginal Christian leader. Brooke is a chartered accountant, company director, coordinator of the Grass Tree Gathering, and the former CEO of Common Grace. Brooke was the first Aboriginal person to be appointed as CEO or national leader of a national Christian organisation in Australia. Brooke is a much sought-after speaker and writer, educator and poet. She is now a consultant working with organisations, companies, churches and schools, including development of reconciliation action plans, workshops on cultural awareness, professional learning and embedding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives into curriculum. Brooke has appeared on national and international television, radio and podcasts, and was recently the guest host of ABC RN's Soul Search. Brooke is currently completing her book, which will be available in 2023. You will hear in our interview, Brooke encourages me to learn an Aboriginal word for hello. So I chose the Darug language because this is most common throughout Sydney, and the Darug Nation is now the place we are recording on. Warrami is hello in the Darug language. So Warrami to all of my listeners. Hello, Brooke. Thank you so much for joining us on Raising Teens.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Brooke, I heard you speak, I think it was last year during NAIDOC Week, and I just would love my listeners to get a bit of a snapshot of your own heritage and what you're doing now. Just give us a little bit of an idea of your history and your heritage.
Yeah, so I'm a Waka Waka woman. Waka Waka Nation is one of the over 300 nations of Aboriginal peoples in these lands now called Australia. Waka Waka country is about 3 hours drive northwest of Brisbane, of Meanjin. But I was actually born on Indigenous country up in far north Queensland and grew up on Gubbi Gubbi country, specifically Redcliffe, just north of Brisbane. Gubbi Gubbi country extends up the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, and then Waka Waka is the neighbouring nation to the west of Gubbi Gubbi country. I did all of my schooling, all my growing up, and have lived most of my life on Gubbi Gubbi country. And then the last 3 years have lived in the place now called Sydney, on the lands of the Gadigal and the Wongal peoples, the Eora Nation. And so they're all important parts of my identity. My Aboriginality comes through my maternal line. So my mum, back to my mum's mum, my nan's mum, my great-grandmother, and then all of our generations before that are from Waka Waka country. And so for Aboriginal people, where we're from isn't necessarily where we've grown up or lived. Where we're from is where our family heritage is from. And today I actually have the privilege of living on Waka Waka country. And some of the distinctives of Waka Waka country are our beautiful bunya pines. They're quite distinctive. Numerous native grasslands are also a feature of Waka Waka country. And I especially love to watch the sunrise and the sunset on my country.
I've seen on social media you have a love for trees.
Yes, and when we talk about country, people might be familiar with an acknowledgement of country, but country, it's not just about the land and it's not just about the peoples. Country is all lands, waters, sky, trees, plants, animals, birds, fish, rocks, mountains, and then all peoples. And so trees play a significant part of our landscape, but also have been significant in the lives of Aboriginal peoples for thousands of years. They've often been a signal of a birthplace even. Our scar trees, and you can still see the scars in the trees today where we would make coolamons or canoes. And that's an important part of our culture is you don't cut down the tree to make these things. The tree has to stay there for all of the generations. So yes, I do love trees.
Beautiful. So, Brooke, my eldest two, they were privileged enough to go to a school where they were able to visit and spend time with Indigenous communities and elders. They spent time in South Australia, Northern Territory, and even in Moree in New South Wales. And they just got to listen and learn. Now, you can hear, and my listeners know, I wasn't born in Australia, and there's a big migrant population in Australia. And so people like myself, we didn't grow up learning about or understanding about Indigenous or Aboriginal culture. So for people like me, would you give us some kind of idea of appropriate terms, appropriate customs, things that are really important to Aboriginal peoples, kind of a quick lesson perhaps that you might do in schools or with Australian parents, anything that you think is important for us to know or recognise?
No, that's a great question and one that I get asked all of the time. And it's not just for recent migrants. There's people whose generations have been here for 8 generations, if we think about the last 200 to 250 years, who are still learning this information as well. And so what I hope is that people just come with love and respect and compassion. And through those things, learn which is the right term to use and to not let not knowing the right terminology prevent you from entering the listening, learning and loving and the relationship if you have the opportunity to meet, or even like listening through podcasts is an important part of building relationship with Aboriginal peoples. So some of the terms, many of them are correct, but I often use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it does often come to a personal preference for us. That personal preference sadly often comes from how another term might have been used in a racist context towards us. So I use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So Aboriginal peoples across these lands now called Australia. The Torres Strait Islander peoples come from over 100 islands in the Torres Strait, which is the body of water between the tip of Queensland and Papua New Guinea. And we have very separate cultures between Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples. One of those is our musical instruments. Aboriginal people known for our clapsticks, didgeridoos or yidaki. Torres Strait Islanders, a big drum that they use, a special Torres Strait Islander drum, different types of dances. And also there's the diversity between Aboriginal peoples from over 300 nations and the Torres Strait Islanders amongst their different islands. Both collectively, Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the Indigenous peoples of Australia. So when I'm talking in a global and world context, that's when I'll use Indigenous. Sadly, one of the reasons I also don't use Indigenous is because of the way it's been used racistly. Some predominantly white Australians will say that they're Indigenous because the grammatical and dictionary definition means born of the land, and so they use it to like deny our identity, which is really hurtful, and a number of other personal situations where Indigenous sadly has been used racistly against me. It's also geographical. I come from the second largest Aboriginal community in Australia, which is Brisbane, the largest being Sydney. Sydney is the largest Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population community in Australia. There are more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Sydney than the whole of the Northern Territory. And so this is part of the education that I do as well, because people just don't realise we're often probably, if you're living in the capital cities, we're more likely to be your next door neighbour. And I guess it's lifting the veil as to who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are today. We are the world's oldest living continuing cultures, but people's perception of what we might look like isn't necessarily the reality. So we come in every shade and colour in terms of our skin colour, and that's not what determines whether we're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. It's where our family heritages come from. Some of us have fairer skin, and if you don't know why that is, then you don't know the true history of this country.
So I've heard you talk, you mentioned fairer skin, and I've heard you talk about how that's been used in hurtful ways to you. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yes, and it's the one thing, particularly as I work with young people, teens and children today, that if that's something that they can get at that young age, then we're setting up for a better Australia for all Australians. Often it's still happening in schools that I go into. The students will say, "Oh, you don't look Aboriginal." And it's like, well, who do you think does look like an Aboriginal person? And so educating those young people who then go home and talk about the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and the leadership from meeting one Aboriginal person, particularly Aboriginal Christian leaders, but who have also been incredible leaders and social justice and civil rights leaders. So like William Cooper, Pearl Gibbs, today's Aboriginal Christian leaders like Auntie Jean Phillips, Uncle Pastor Ray Minnicon, to see our beautiful diversity and leadership.
Sadly, many Australians don't know much about Indigenous culture. Throughout this interview, Brooke refers to these lands now called Australia and reminds us that this nation is made up of individual nations, each with their own clans, language, and culture. If you would like to find out more, First Languages Australia is working with regional language centres nationally to develop a map of Australia's first languages. Their resource called Gambe, which in the Bachelor language means together, also has teacher's notes, and it's aligned with the Australian curriculum. You can find a link in the show notes.
You know, today we use the word nations instead of tribes because we had whole systems of law and living and governance. And we still do today, particularly when I'm working with teens and young people and children. They love learning about that because, you know, we were never nomadic hunter-gatherers, and we're still trying to overcome that term and how that has set in people's minds. And it was never true. You could look at that map, and it's actually the AATSIS Indigenous map of Australia, and people can purchase that so that people can start to learn. And it's not a perfect map. There are many nations missing, but it's a good representation and actually helps you to open your eyes to what has been here for thousands of years and still today.
Yeah. And so, you know, on this podcast, we talk a lot about how COVID has affected teenagers really around the world. What have you noticed about the effects of COVID on Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal young people? Have there been patterns that you have seen?
As state borders started to close and travel was restricted, that's not the first time it's ever happened in these lands now called Australia. This was one of the results of the 1967 referendum, that before that, the states and territories restricted the movement of Aboriginal peoples. And not to cross the state border, you couldn't even leave your community or your reserve or your mission. You had to get permission to leave that very small community. And often that permission was denied. And so we've lived this, and this is where the relationship also needs to come understand that we lived through that for a long, decades, if not over a century. I hope that drives a compassion for what Aboriginal people experienced and being removed from your families and not able to see them. And, you know, I'm not trying to relate the two together, but COVID gives you a very small insight into what did happen to Aboriginal peoples.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. That's a good illustration.
And then obviously with our chronic health needs, the reality is Australia has not closed the gap. We still are dying 11 to 17 years younger than the non-Indigenous population in Australia with very complex health needs. And some of those are related to the true history. You know, up until 1967 and even the early 1970s, the stolen wages, Aboriginal people were paid in tea, sugar, flour, and blankets. But if your diet is tea, sugar, flour for decades, there's obvious health outcomes. It's the high rates of diabetes, the kidney disease that we're facing today. And so then to put on a global pandemic and COVID into already complex health needs, you know, was very confronting and quite frightening. And I think the other sad reality of what COVID meant for particularly Aboriginal peoples was that In some instances, there wasn't much difference because of the poverty that exists. The reality, and it's part of our true history, has affected our present and the high levels of poverty in our communities. And so when you're living in poverty, you actually don't get to move around that much because you don't have the finances to be able to travel interstate or travel overseas. Also, because of that poverty, many Aboriginal children and young people don't have access to the same kind of technology and devices that non-Indigenous Australians have as well. So that disconnection and their education, I think, has been affected as well.
So going on to education, I've seen a school in Coffs Harbour. It's the first bilingual Indigenous school in New South Wales. Can you talk with us a bit about the importance of the effects for young Aboriginal peoples learning in their own language? And I'd love to hear about your own language.
Yes, I'd love to talk about language. That school in Coffs Harbour is such a great example and has brought so much excitement for many Aboriginal peoples about what is actually possible. You know, even in terms of my own language, I haven't had my Waka Waka language, but a few weeks ago, the State Library of Queensland came out to Waka Waka country and held a workshop. I was part of the first group of Waka Waka people to be learning our language. So it's amazing that we have access to this incredible dictionary of our language that's been held by the State Library of Queensland. But it's the very first time we're learning our language, which, you know, brought one of the elders to tears the first time he heard some Waka Waka words. And so, yeah, it's just so important. And language is such a vital part of culture. You know, I've been campaigning and talking for a long time in the Northern Territory. The children going to school, often they can speak at least 4 Aboriginal languages and then English is their 5th language. But the previous governments have refused to teach in Indigenous languages and they've only been able to teach in English, even though every one of those kids knows a common language out of those, say, 4 Aboriginal languages, and they've got elders in the community who can speak language and teach in the language. And so we're just starting to see that change now, which is just amazing. I just can't wait to see the educational outcomes. You don't have to learn English first to then be able to learn maths and science and so forth. And so there's so much I think the rest of Australia can learn from Aboriginal peoples and our language. I'm encouraging people to learn an Aboriginal word a week. It might be from the local area where you live or another area, and just keep our languages alive.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, that's a good challenge for me. I'm going to try that. And so, Brooke, what do you think the connection then is for young people learning in their own language? What do you envision or what do you hope will change for young people learning in their own language?
Well, for starters, it removes a barrier to learning. Secondly, you know, our languages are just so beautiful and diverse and they've been here for thousands of years. And so when people appreciate our languages, it restores that sense of pride and excitement about our culture and our peoples. So I think it brings hope, you know, for our young people and hope for the future. And yeah, and that non-Indigenous people want to learn these languages. That's super exciting that we've got this special thing to be able to share.
Yeah, I mean, when I visited New Zealand, I was at a school library and they had labels, Maori labels all over the library and all over the school. And I came back wondering why we weren't doing that in Australia, because I come from a country where they also speak 11 official different languages and the importance of that in my country's history. And yeah, I think that would be a beautiful thing if we saw more of that in Australia.
That's right. And I mean, that's what has happened in New Zealand. Aotearoa is actually the nation coming together about 30 years ago and collectively going on that journey. This is what my Pakeha and Māori friends tell me. And so sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, does that mean Australia's 30 years behind? But I think we can use it as an encouragement and we're starting to see the glimpses of it today.
Yeah, beautiful. And also, Brooke, you presented at the Queensland Parliament Community Support and Services Committee about raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 years old to 14. And as a psychologist, I look at that and go, I'm so glad you're campaigning for this, because 10 years old they're such babies. And so, I understand there's kind of two camps broadly. Some people will say, well, if young people are badly behaved or they're violent offenders, we need to just clamp down on their behavior and that's that. Other people will say, well, yep, Australia's now reaping what they've sown and it's kind of none of our business. We need to just let Aboriginal peoples deal with that on their own. And so it's nothing we can really do. What do you believe we need to do? What do our young people need from us?
Our young people, and even to especially remember, these are children. Our children need love and care and support and encouragement. They're not going to find that in a jail cell. We're getting condemned by the United Nations. Internationally, the recommended age is 14 years. Aboriginal peoples have been campaigning for this hashtag Raise the Age for many years, but particularly very intensively over the last 3 years. And in 2020, the government changed the Closing the Gap targets and said that the Attorney Generals of each state and territory just needed another 12 months to consider that. That 12 months rolled around in 2021 to raise the age, and they still said they needed more time. Then came proposed legislation in Queensland and this parliamentary inquiry I got to speak at. It was rejected and voted down. And there were, I think, 3,000 submissions and only 2 said not to raise the age. And so you're going against what the community wants as well. And so it just makes no sense. But what is the present and the future we want for our children? Because there's been enough research to say when any young person enters the juvenile justice system, they are so likely to end up in the adult prison system. And I think, you heard me say that we're sending 10-year-olds to jail. I think that's what a lot of non-Indigenous people don't realise, is that a detention centre isn't a fun and games place, it's jail. In Queensland, every one of the 10-year-olds is Aboriginal. And, I also encourage people to go and read the words of the Statement from the Heart. There's a particular line, whilst the Statement from the Heart calls for voice, treaty and truth, there's a part in there that says Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, mainly Aboriginal people, are the most incarcerated people on the planet. And we are not an innately criminal people. But part of what is playing out is that racism. So I encourage people, if you want to enter the discussion, go and watch the whole day's proceedings of where I presented. I was only allowed to give a 3-minute speech, and then there was question time. But myself and Auntie Bonnie Robinson, who's another amazing Aboriginal Christian leader, saying the same things. There's no time to delay this any further. Please release our young people. And one of the reasons they're not raising the age is because they're like, well, what do we do with these young people? Those between the ages of 10 and 14 in Queensland, you're only talking about 83 children and young people in any 1 year. So it's not actually that many young people we're talking about, 83. And so I said, I'm actually a chartered accountant, one of only 30 Indigenous chartered accountants in all of Australia. And so I said to the committee, we estimate $100,000 per year to keep one of these 83 young people in jail. And the committee stopped me and they said, oh, no, Miss Prentis, it's actually $250,000 per year. And so I was making the case of, I hope they had someone doing financial modelling about ways of reinvestment, but of course they don't have anyone. But $250,000 per year is probably 2.5 social workers full-time per child, which would make so much more difference than having them taken away from their family, their culture, their community, their education and schooling. And so I just hope we can dream of a different present and future. And the other reason I encourage people to watch the whole proceedings, you had incredible non-Indigenous foster carers begging for the age to be raised. Lawyers, non-Indigenous lawyers who are working with our young people. Because, there's that rhetoric out there that, well, Aboriginal people and our young people are committing more crimes or more violent crimes. And it's actually not true. There was one example, and this is on the public record, a young person in a out-of-home care environment. They had an item of personal property removed from them and placed in a room, and it was locked. And so they broke the lock to retrieve their personal property in their own home. And they went in and out of the room several times. and they were charged with 5 counts of break and enter. And so that's then on your record and what sends you to jail for a long time. Another situation in their own home, it was an out of care home situation, but it's now their home, and they flicked their foster sibling with a tea towel. They were charged with assault. So this is what's happening to our precious children and young people.
If you want to know more about or watch the hearing itself, there is a link to the Raise the Age public hearing in the show notes. And so your work in schools, I know you're going into schools a lot. What are you doing at the moment to teach young people about Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginal culture?
Yeah, so it's been really wonderful to be able to go into schools. I've been doing schools work for the last 10 years, but now it's kind of like what I'm doing full time. And I'm just loving it. It's especially about being able to, with our teachers, to equip and empower them, particularly with teaching how to embed the Indigenous perspectives in curriculum, to help it become real and tangible by having an Aboriginal friend who comes in and walks alongside the teachers, but then can come into the classrooms and work with the students. And to see the teachers come alive and the students come alive is just so wonderful. And I guess I really believe to tackle injustice, I think will come through relationship, and especially I call reconciliation friendship, because we know what a friend is. You know, you celebrate together, you have times of joy, you listen to one another. And this is what I get the young people to tell me. This is often their responses. They even say you tell the truth to each other, you care for each other, you're there in the sad times as well. And so for us here in these lands now called Australia, to think of reconciliation that way with non-Indigenous peoples and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, I think it would be able to close the gap quite soon if we were able to embrace that concept of friendship. You know, it can't be the only place it's happening to bring about that truth-telling on a national scale and ending injustice and racism. It will take all aspects of society, but to see that happening in our schools and bringing our culture alive, that it's not just this ancient culture, it's alive today in the Aboriginal peoples who are in every part of these lands now called Australia.
Yeah. I'm so grateful for those relationships that my children have had. You know, my daughter befriended an Aboriginal teenager. Well, she was preteens at that stage. And if Tracy's listening, hi, Tracy, it's the mum. But I'm so grateful for that time that my daughter got to learn from Tracy's daughter, and the times my children have been, you know, involved with Indigenous communities, because I've learned. And so I think as adults, we can learn from our kids, and making it a very natural part of our conversations to talk about Indigenous culture and Aboriginal young people. So, Brooke, what is your greatest hope for Aboriginal teens in Australia?
Oh, my greatest hope for Aboriginal teens into the future is that they don't have to justify their existence. The burden would be lifted from them of having to do the truth telling. So I would love to see us as a nation where every Australian learns the true history. Our Indigenous teens are believed when they say that they're Aboriginal, that their identity isn't questioned. And, you know, I think as a 17-year-old Aboriginal girl, when I finished year 12, that was my greatest hope. And sadly, 25 years later, the Aboriginal students I'm actually working with in schools, they're still facing their Aboriginality being questioned. And so it's not something we can change. We need our non-Indigenous friends and brothers and sisters to change your families, your friends, your workplaces, your communities to make that future possible. I hope the parents and teens and young people of Australia can be part of my dream, an Australia that we build together, an Australia built on truth, justice, love, and hope.
Although I didn't grow up in Australia, listening to Brooke reminded me about how important it is to listen to Indigenous people's voices about what is needed in this country, and also how important it is for us to ask questions. As parents, we need to talk to our children about racism and model compassion, understanding, and kindness. If you would like to find out more about Brooke's work or have her come and speak at your school, you can go to brookeprentis.com. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode. And in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.